Hi everyone. This is a video that I've been wanting to make for quite some time really, but there have been two things that have prevented me from doing it. One has been my illness and trying to find a time when my speech was okay and I'm not jumping around too much. And the other really is to do with how this might be received by some of my Christian friends, and with the circumstances we've gone through, whether I could actually deal with the flack. Now, I have written about this elsewhere, so I have already tested the waters, and I think sometimes you just need to take the plunge and say things as they are, and be firm with the convictions that you have. Now, as most of you know who are watching this video, the last few years for me and my family have not been brilliant. I mean, what with my health and things. And then, of course, last September, losing David, it's not been an easy time. And I've found that my faith has probably been tested almost to the limit. It was one thing dealing with being ill, and quite another dealing with losing David. And losing David has really made me consider some of the things that I held to be true in terms of my faith. Now, this is not the first time that I've been challenged about this particular aspect of my faith. And the aspect I'm talking about really is the whole doctrine that the church in general tends to hold about what happens to those who don't believe, and particularly about the whole concept of eternal punishment. I mean, I don't mean, when I'm saying eternal, I mean that God punishes the lost, not just according to their sins, but forever and ever and ever without end. And really, this first started to bother me quite early on in my Christian faith, when I lost my father. And my father wasn't a Christian. If anything, he was quite anti anything to do with God. He'd been put off by Christians a church that was near him. It was very legalistic, and he really wasn't interested in anything. And when he died, I remember going to his funeral and afterwards wishing that I didn't have any faith, because everyone around me was able to talk about him being somewhere else, about him being in a better place, but my Christian theology said that that wasn't the case, because my Christian theology said that if you die without Jesus, then there's no hope. You die, you go to hell, and you're tormented forever, and there is no way out. And it bothered me. It bothered me a lot. And I did what most Christians do, and that is to try to rationalise it and say things like, well, I didn't know what happened to him on his last moments. I didn't know whether he finally turned to God. And I rationalised it and carried on with my life and left it with God, and thought that's what I had to do. You see, I've been so convinced that this teaching was completely biblical and was without something I wasn't able to question. It's interesting how Christians are taught this quite often. The church has often become so firm in trying to keep everyone thinking the same thing that it makes Christians unable to actually see what the scriptures say, and to see even what other Christians have said in earlier times, and we just believe because we're told to believe, rather than because we know that's what is in God's heart. So anyhow, that was quite a difficult time, and I got through it. As I said, I rationalised things. I thought I had to stick with that, because I really thought it was a doctrine that was unalterable, that it was part of a fundamental of the Christian faith. So, of course, when it came to losing David, this really affected me quite badly. I know that David made a commitment as a child, and as a young person he made a commitment, but David wasn't living a Christian life. And again, it depends, you see, where you stand on your theology. Now, I know that some of those who aren't Christians who might be listening to this won't understand this, but there are basically two thoughts in Christianity in terms of the eternal destiny of believers, and one is the Calvinistic view, which is that God foreordains those who are going to be saved, because it's impossible for mankind, men and women, to turn to God unless God chooses them and foreordains their salvation. And they believe that once saved, always saved, but they always tie on to the end that if you are truly saved. And the only way you know you're truly saved is if you continue with God. Now the Arminian side, which is another school of thought, is that God offers salvation to everyone, and whoever believes he accepts, but you can lose your faith and you can lose your salvation, and salvation is only determined upon your faith at the moment of time, in many ways. So both of these actually hold no sense of security at all for those who really think about it. There is no real sense of security in either of these positions. So anyhow, I was left, having lost David, having all sorts of questions about what happened to him. And it really made me think very carefully about what I believe. Now, I had been challenged about these beliefs and things I read in the past 2 years before this, but I've been unprepared to make a stand because I personally don't like conflict, and I'll be honest about that. I'd rather have a fairly easy life. But these are so important because I know there are other Christian parents who have lost their children in the same sort of circumstances who will go through the same questioning. And my first thought was that God had really duped me. The scriptures talk about children being a blessing, but what's a blessing about bringing children into the world, not knowing whether they're going to come to God, knowing that they actually would be, the likelihood is they will spend all eternity in agonising in hell. Now, I'm sorry, but that just doesn't ring true. It seems a God that would do such a thing is barbaric. He's not a loving God. And I really thought this through. I thought that, okay, as Christians often we make the excuse and we say, well, we don't, we like to think that God always moves in the hearts of our children and they always become Christians and live godly lives. But I know enough people to know that that's not true. Most parents never have to go through the pain of seeing their children die and having to deal with this, but when you do, you suddenly realise how important this question is. And I started thinking, how on earth can if this is true, if there's even the remotest possibility that David is completely lost forevermore, how on earth could I serve a God that would do such a thing to someone who I love so much? How could I really serve a God who thought so little of him? I wrestled with this. There's no way that I could serve a God who does such a thing. But there's a far wider issue in this. And it's not just me. I mean, there is a good possibility that David did believe. And I don't know what happened in those last moments. See, here I go rationalising, but I don't. But I know for many that isn't the case. And the whole idea that God brings people into the world knowing that the vast majority of them are going to reject them, and knowing that the end place is eternal punishment, just seems to me barbaric. And I started to question whether I really wanted to serve such a God. Now, this is not a question of whether I believe in God or not. In fact, my faith in God there is a God, is very strong. I know there'll be my non-Christian friends who watch this and think, well, that's crazy, but that's what I believe. And I also believe it's important to be biblical. There's no point being a Christian and not believing what the scriptures say. So I was in a quandary. What do I do with this? I certainly didn't feel that I'd want to carry on serving God if that was really the case. But then deep in my heart, I felt God tell me, that He loved David more than I love him, and I know how much I love David.